Well, Descartes would really like you're saying that we know the mind better than anything else, because that's what he thought. But the problem that people worry about a lot is this. So while, we're really intimately acquainted with our own mind, we live within our own mind, you might say, the question that people wonder about is, what is the relationship of the mind to the body? So is the mind just identical with the brain, is what we would say nowadays, or is the mind something different, or is maybe the human being a single thing, but it has two completely different kinds of properties, like mental properties, but also physical properties. So it's really the relationship between the mind and the body that puzzles people, and has puzzled people for a very, very long time. Well, probably the most famous one is the one that Descartes offered in the 17th century. What Descartes started with was the idea that you could do the following. You could imagine that you are thinking and you are having all kinds of experiences. Conscious experiences is what we'd say nowadays. Sensory experiences. You can also be thinking abstractly. But you can imagine that being the case while there is no physical world at all, while bodies do not exist. So for instance, you could imagine that your mind exists, your thinking happens, and maybe God exists, but there are no bodies at all. And that for Descartes was a starting point for an argument for dualism, because he thought that that shows that our mental states, our thinking, is really something different from what you can find in the physical world. That's the central idea of the argument. A real distinction means it's a distinction between two things. So res in Latin means thing, and so real distinction means a distinction between two things. And so for Descartes it was true that the mind and the body are two different things. Whereas, as I indicated before, somebody else might say the human being is a single thing which has two different kinds of properties. And that would be a different type of dualism that we now call property dualism. And then, of course, there are materialists who think that mental states just are physical states. Typically, the idea would be that mental states are brain states. So Descartes was a dualist in the sense of what we call a substance dualist. And substance is really a technical term for a thing. So mind and body are two different things. That's the basic idea. For Descartes, that was certainly an important idea, that the mind and the body can exist without one another, because one thing that was on his mind was religious questions about the ability of the soul to exist after the body dies. And for him, the soul and the mind are the same thing. So part of what he was trying to defend was the idea that the mind or soul can exist without the body. And he thought that if he could show that the mind or soul is a different thing from the body, then even if the body dies and falls apart, like happens to human bodies after we die, the death of the body and the decomposition of the body, that has no implications for the existence of the soul. So then if mind and body are two different things, then the mind or soul can continue to exist after the body decays and dies. That is indeed a very important part of what he was thinking about. Yeah. A philosophical zombie, yeah, that's for sure. You could have a duplicate of a human body in one sense. So when we talk about philosophical zombies, what we talk about is bodies that have no conscious experience whatsoever. And for Descartes, conscious experience requires an immaterial soul. So if you have a physical duplicate of a body, which he thought was possible, then that physical body would be without any consciousness. Now, another interesting aspect of Descartes' thinking was that human reasoning is also something that belongs to the immaterial mind. And that's what we still think nowadays. But for Descartes, that was a really important part of the picture too. So what that would mean, what would be on his mind as well, is that such a physical zombie, such a philosophical zombie, it would not have conscious experience, but also any kind of human activity that requires intelligence, actual, real abstract reasoning, that kind of activity you would not find in such a zombie. That's another thing to be absent from a zombie. Sometimes nowadays people say, you know, mental states are just brain states. And then I feel really puzzled. I wonder what those people are like from the inside, as it were. Because when I think about my own experiences, my conscious experiences, like when I feel pain or when I see red or I smell chocolate, for instance, those experiences seem so different from what people talk about when they talk about brain states, that I have real difficulty with the idea that my conscious experiences would just be brain states. That's not to say that I thereby feel like I've shown that they are not, but I find it a very, very puzzling idea that they would be identical with brain states, that conscious experience would be identical with brain states. Now, I should add that Descartes goes beyond that, as I mentioned before, because he thought that mind and body are two different things. So not only are conscious experiences not identical with physical experiences, but in addition he thought that the thing that thinks is distinct from the thing, from the body. And that's a whole further argument, and I'm not sure whether he succeeds in establishing it. It requires really strong metaphysical principles that I think are very contestable. Earlier we talked a bit about the separability of the mind or soul from the body, and that definitely wasn't Descartes' mind, but another angle that was on his mind at least as much was this idea that mental states can't be explained in terms of physical states. And that was not a religious issue, and it wasn't an issue about separability. It was an issue about explanation and whether you can understand one thing in terms of the other. And that also had to do with his conception of the physical world. So for him, one thing that's important about Descartes, that he was committed to mechanistic conception, a mechanistic conception of the physical world. And that meant that the physical world consists of myriads, indefinitely many tiny particles that have shapes and sizes and motions. And everything in the physical world is to be explained in terms of that. But Descartes thought that the mind is just something very, very different from that and can't be explained in terms of these mechanical processes. And so that divide in nature between body and mind, that was really at the heart of his dualism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's still one of the most hotly debated questions in philosophy, certainly in the English-speaking world. This whole question about what is the relationship between the mental and the physical. And there really are two ways in which Descartes has been really important for that discussion. And one way was that, what we now call thought experiment that I mentioned earlier, where he says, look, we can imagine that we're thinking and having conscious experiences and maybe thinking abstractly. And we can imagine that happening without there being any physical world, and that, he thought, suggested something really different about the mental and the physical. And that thought experiment still really grabs people, and people still really talk about it and what the implications of it are. So that's really one way in which Descartes still reverberates in contemporary discussions. But the other way is a way in which there's other aspects of his thought that we haven't talked about at all yet. And that is that before Descartes, philosophers thought that what cannot be explained in terms of matter is really abstract thought, intellectual thought, or rational thought. But sensory experiences, they generally thought, they are physical processes. And what happens with Descartes is that he shifts the boundary between the mental and the immaterial on one hand and the corporeal on the other hand. And he says, no, our conscious sensory experiences also cannot be explained in materialistic terms. And that means that you got a whole new picture of where the boundary between the mental and the physical and between the immaterial and the material lies. And that way of drawing that boundary is one that was contested in the 17th century in various ways, but that actually is foundational to 21st century discussions of these issues. So in that sense, Descartes really also shapes the contemporary debate very, very much. Leibniz said he had a different thought experiment, as we now say, from Descartes. He said, imagine a quote-unquote thinking machine. And usually, when we think about a thinking machine, we think about tiny particles. So, and nowadays we think about, brain processes. These are very small processes. But imagine, he said, imagine blowing up a thinking machine so big that it's as big as a mill, so that you walk into it. And then he says, if you walk around in that mill, you wouldn't see anything in that mill that could explain thinking. And so that's another thought experiment that people still really are very inspired by. And people say that shows something puzzling about the mental. But the Achilles argument, the argument that you asked me about, is yet a different argument, because in the Achilles argument, which is a very old argument, it has roots as far back as Plato. In the Achilles argument, what people said was something a little different. So there what they said was, well, take sense experience, for instance. They like to focus on sense experience in this argument. Imagine that you're looking at a face. So you look at the face and you see a mouth and a nose and you see eyes. And now imagine that your mind is a material object. Then the argument goes, one part of your mind, so your brain, one part of your brain would be seeing the mouth, another part would see the nose, another part would see the eyes. But if that's true, then there's not a single subject seeing the whole face. But obviously, we see whole faces. So, the argument goes, that means that our thinking subject, our mind, must be immaterial, because it means that our mind must be something simple that has no parts. And surely, the argument goes, any physical object, including a brain, has parts. So a physical brain, a physical object, can be what senses in us, what sees a face, because there wouldn't be a single thing that sees a whole face. And so that means that the mind has to be an immaterial thing, because it has to have no parts in any sense. So that's the Achilles argument.